Well, thank you all for coming back. Again, my name is John Lukavic. I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Curator of Native Arts here at the Denver Art Museum. And I'm thrilled to welcome some friends, colleagues, and just wonderful people. Gregg Deal on the stage left, or far left, whatever that is over there to my right. Gregg is an enrolled citizen of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. He's a contemporary artist who works in performance, in painting, and spoken word work, a variety of other media. His bio is all in the thing, so I won't go into too much detail. We have Jamie Okuma with us today from La Jolla, California, and reservation, excuse me. Not the city, but the reservation, La Jolla Reservation, excuse me. She is enrolled. Are you enrolled, Lisenio? Yeah, and then also Shoshone Bannock. She's an incredible Indigenous artist, fashion designer. We're currently working with her on a project as well, and we're thrilled to have her join us today. We also have Ramona Beltrán, who is a local here with us in the Denver community. She's a professor at Denver University. University of Denver, sorry. It's the old Big 12 thing, like Oklahoma University of Oklahoma, where I went to school. But sorry, it's a football thing, or at least hockey. And I guess DU doesn't have a football team, do they? I don't know. Anyway, sorry. Okay, but we're thrilled to have Ramona join us here today because she's going to be able to provide some incredibly important nuance and understanding to some of the issues that we've been started discussing today. I want to kind of start off really kind of by picking up on that this panel really is going to talk about certain aspects of what our keynote speaker, Glenn Adamson, was able to address. But specifically kind of this instinctual reaction. And some of what he was talking about one particular extreme is something that is very important in Indigenous communities, and it's a very common feeling. But there's very specific root reasons why these issues are so instinctual and so incorporate such strong emotion, which we will be getting into here. A few words here. So we've talked about, various other words that were presented by Glenn: appropriation, appreciation, inspiration, violence, trauma, and power. Now, one can appreciate something without appropriating. It's really the way that you act upon this appreciation that ultimately impacts how it's perceived. And as Glenn mentioned, there is risk-taking involved. You have to make a calculated risk, whether it is intentional or not, conscious or not, on how people are going to respond to what you have done. Violence, violence in the art world can occur in a variety of different ways. It can occur through exclusion. It can be, occur through like a bad critic's response to something you've done. But when appropriation occurs, even when appreciation is present, there is violence that can still be felt by people. Now, it's important to note that there's issues of rights and access that occur in many different Indigenous communities, specifically related to the visual arts. And the line between freedom and cultural protocols, even for Indigenous artists, is something that really does need to be teased out a little bit more. Glenn mentioned it a little bit with talking about Jeffrey Gibson's work and his strategic appropriation that he does, even within communities. But it's also an issue that Indigenous artists talk about amongst themselves about what is appropriate to draw inspiration from or to appropriate in the work. Power. There is a recognition that not all information is accessible, or not all aspects of visual culture or even culture that are accessible to anyone. This is something that is rooted in most Indigenous cultures, is that which is counter to the Western idea that I'm free to take whatever I want. I'm free to be inspired by whatever I want. I'm free to construct my own identity however I want. That freedom is largely rooted in power structures that are tied to, in many ways, white privilege. even in my freedom for me personally, to limit the instinctual reactions that I have to appropriation is rooted in my own white privilege, because at the end of the day, I am not the one who's impacted by the act of appropriation. So my ability to remove myself from the situation and say, oh, okay, I'm not really offended by that, is something that not everyone shares. And we're going to get into some of the issues on why not everyone is free to make that separation. I'm just going to quickly go through a few slides here, just stage some of the conversations we're going to have. The fashion industry, which was one of the starting conversations we had about this symposium, is particularly responsible for violence against Indigenous people through the appropriation and the perpetuation of stereotypes. These have direct connections to what Ramona will explore a little bit later here, what are referred to as microaggressions, and which I know Gregg's work has specifically addressed as well. There was a quote about this particular ensemble saying that the outfit meant to represent Thanksgiving sparked outrage within Native American communities for its misappropriation of cultural attire. Now, there are also other issues which Jamie is going to get into here in just a moment, which Glenn also referenced in terms of appropriation versus plagiarism. So on the far left here is addressed by Bethany Yellowtail from her Crow Pop series, or a collection. With it is KTZ's copy done by designer Marjan Bajoski. Of this line, Pajoski called it, quote, a tribute to the primal woman indigenous to this land who evolves into a sexualized, empowered being. Now, that's incredibly problematic anyway, but he didn't draw inspiration from anything, he copied it. I mean, it's clear as day. You then have on the right half here, an Inuit man wearing a coat on the left, whose name is Ava, who made the original parka with designs of protection that came to him, whether it was intuitively or through a dream. And in these Inuit communities, there are cultural laws that protect these original designs from duplication, which are not. Here we're kind of getting into almost like looking at legal systems and copyright, because this is an indigenous law that is part of a cultural protocol that is not necessarily codified into written law that is enforced by the dominant society around them. European designer Kokan Tozai, whose company claims to, quote, capture the beauty, truth, and power behind indigenous things. Again, he's not capturing the essence of anything. He's copying directly exactly what you see here. The aim was potentially appreciation, but that's not how it was received by his family. Ava the shaman's great-granddaughter, Salome Awa, is quoted as calling this a stolen piece, adding that these, and I quote, these are sacred images, and they're using them, and for profit of all things. Here at the Denver Art Museum, if you've seen on the third floor of the Stampede exhibition, the shield on the left was, it's the personal shield design of Joseph Notuhorns from Standing Rock. There are many versions of this, mostly done on muslin, that were sold by Joseph Notuhorns to a tourist market. But there's two of them known that are on leather that were his personal ones. This one, which is from about 1875, I think, and then a slightly more recent one, maybe about 15 years later, which was recently acquired into the collection at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Within a week of the Metropolitan using this image in their marketing for this acquisition, a shirt came out from Ralph Lauren. Now, you may not see the immediate connection here, but in the lower corner, there is this faded image that is a direct copy of Joseph Notuhorn's personal shield design. Now, on appreciation, there is trauma that is experienced by people, indigenous people specifically, when appropriation and appreciation occur. Largely because, and this is something Gregg and I were just talking about last night, at times, say in the 1940s and 1950s, when young white children were running around suburbia playing cowboys and Indians, it was illegal for indigenous people to practice their own religion and ceremonies. At the same time that these kids were having fun dressing up as Indians, Indian children themselves were sent to boarding schools, and they were beaten for speaking their own language and trying to practice their own culture. This is some of the roots on where some of this historic trauma has come in, which I'm using terms now that Ramona will help us understand a little bit better here. So when someone says that they appreciate the arts of indigenous artists and then take from them, that again adds an additional level of trauma. There is no give back, there is no recognition. It's also important to note that of the 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States, there are only about 12 of them that used feather headdresses like these. And even within them, there were only individual specific people who had the rights to do some, to wear them. So when you go to a musical concert and you see hipsters wearing feather headdresses like this, it's a form of stolen valor. And if you're familiar with that concept, it's when, you know, someone may be wearing a military uniform and military ranks and honors that they did not earn themselves. And that is exactly the same analogous issue that happens when these are used. Now, Native artists in many ways have addressed cultural appropriation in a variety of different ways, sometimes with humor, which is very common, as we hopefully we'll get to in some ways in our conversations here. But definitely addressing them straight on. So these two works here are by Nicholas Galinon, and the one on the right is also a collaboration with Merritt Johnson. The one on the left here is a split image between a Princess Leia from the New Hope, the original Star Wars movie, and a Hopi Tewa woman who is famously wearing what is become iconic as people refer to as a squash blossom style hairstyle. But that's exactly where Princess Leia's hairstyle came from. But of course, the movie didn't recognize that. There were no indigenous actors in the movie. There were no indigenous directors or producers in the movie. Yet they directly took from this image from Edward Curtis, this photo, and used it as inspiration for the costuming. The one on the right actually is kind of I think is brilliant. This is a performance art piece called Remove, where Merritt and Nicholas set up a laser tattoo removal service on a street corner in Santa Fe to remove tribal tattoos, which again are a form of, the use of them are a form of, I guess you could say appreciation, but in some ways it's also appropriation, however you want to take that. That was just kind of my very brief introduction to some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. But with this, I'm going to move over and hand this off to Ramona Beltrán, who can help define a few of the terms that I just used, and then we're going to really launch into seeing how all of this actually plays out in practice.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. I'm Ramona Beltrán, and my family is Yaqui and Mexica descent, originally from northern Mexico on my mother's side, Anglo on my father's side. I grew up with my mom, and so that's the cultural standpoint that I come from. I identify as Indigenous Chicana. My family took a long route up through northern Mexico, Arizona, and into what is, now we kind of refer to ourselves as Bay Area Chicanos, but have a long history with indigenous diaspora. So, is it still up? Oh, do I need to go back?
No, you need to go back to my presentation. Sorry.
So I'm going to just define for you a little bit more about what historical trauma is and how it relates to cultural appropriation. So historical trauma is defined as a collective and cumulative wounding across generations that results from massive cataclysmic events targeting a community. The trauma is held personally as well as collectively and can be transmitted over generations.
You can fast forward.
Oh, okay, now it's
One more. There
There we
go.
go. So this is sort of the context that can get us to this understanding of how deeply rooted the impacts in the here and now are to a history of colonization. So historically traumatic events are defined as catastrophic upheaval and community-based incidents that cause high levels of community distress. And they include mostly planned phenomenon by governments, government-sponsored institutions, and increasingly by corporations or big money. And so some of these events for Indigenous communities are like forced relocation, child removal, boarding school. What are some other things we all have been through? Genocide, that little thing. Right. And for other communities, some events might count like slavery, Japanese internment. And one thing that's really important to consider, I know we think about the term historical from a Western standpoint as being a history that's sometime in the past, but from an Indigenous perspective, history is in the past, but it's in the here and now. It's yesterday, it's tomorrow, it's always with us. And the woman who coined this term, historical trauma, she's a Lakota scholar named Maria Yellowhurst Braveheart, and she talked about that specifically, that it's not linear, it's something that's always with us, it's multidimensional, and we're creating history in the here and now. So historical trauma, I like to think of it when I'm trying to explain it to folks from the beginning, is we can consider the historically anchored events that have happened to our communities, but the most important, well, not the most important, but another important component of it is the cumulative nature and the compounded nature, which means it's historically anchored, but then continued to compound over time with the ongoing, persistent discrimination, systemic oppression, and that's big things from, being removed from your original lands, being prohibited from practicing your original traditions, your language, and then also not having access to employment or housing or health care. And then there's also these other ways that it's continued. And the way that I explain this to my students is that it's like the spirit of colonization and genocide continues through these large and smaller acts. And one of the ways that we think about these smaller acts being part of this persistent daily exposure to systemic oppression is through microaggressions. And one point I want to make about the persistent discrimination and the impacts of that on our health and bodies is that science is showing that long-term exposure to even these kind of lower level, more subtle experiences of racism actually impact our health even more, shorten our lives, more than a singular traumatic event. So we have the traumatic event, and then we have the ongoing big and small experiences of racism. And so microaggressions are defined as these everyday verbal, sometimes nonverbal ways that people look at you, maybe follow you in a store. They're just these slights, ways that people might kind of insult you. From my own perspective, I've been called Pocahontas, which is like my people are from not even close. and I've also been told I don't look Indigenous, and so therefore I don't get to be Indigenous, right? So it's those are the kinds of messages that continue to compound on top of these historically traumatic events. And I just put together a small compilation of some microaggression images, and even nowadays we're having this conversation about whether microaggressions are actually micro or if they really do have larger impacts, and maybe we should be using different language. But so some of this aligns with what John was showing. There's this appropriation in fashion. The gentleman with the bow and the feathers, that was from a Saks catalog. And then there was a Miss America pageant, and then of course a festival flyer. And then we have these other images that are really talking about violence against Native people. And this picture of this This is actually from a football game, a high school football game a couple years ago, where the students said, "Hey, Indians, get ready to leave in a trail of tears, round 2." And these are just the little ways, big ways, that the messages of erasure and extinction and violence are continued. And I put them together like this for my final point to illustrate how, at the same time, our cultures and our cultural items, from jewelry to food to dress, are taken at such a rapid pace. And while at the same time, our people are erased. So we're exoticized and sexualized, and at the same time, where is the conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or the high rate of violence against Indigenous women, in contrast to these things? So at one point, it's like, you want our culture, but you don't want us. And the violence that is within the tension of those two things is what we have to live with. And I don't want to close on that as the absolute final thought. What I think is really powerful and important with historical trauma as a theoretical concept is, within the concept, there is this notion that there are things that we can do to interrupt the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And what we're finding in the science is that it's actually through our culture that we do that. I mean, in our communities, we know that. We've known that for a long time. Culture cures. But now the science is supporting it. And not to remain on the victimization of colonization, but to remember, as Indigenous people, we are incredibly resilient, and that even though we carry this intergenerational trauma, we also carry resistance, we also carry wisdom, and those things are most clearly conveyed and powerful, I think, through our art, through our stories. And so with that, I will hand it over.
Okay. Can you go back to the loop of images, please? With that, Gregg Deal has done a variety of different performance art pieces that have addressed, or at least brought to light, the issues of microaggressions. Specifically, your works, The Last American Indian on Earth, as well as the performance art piece you did in D.C., called Redskin. Could you tell us a little bit about those those performances, and also like how they came about and your experiences with them?
Yeah. So The Last American Indian on Earth was sort of my first official performance piece, and it was entirely based around perception of stereotype. I wore an outfit that embodied a headdress and breechcloth, and I had moccasins. They were basically white Vans that I painted to look like moccasins because I had to walk everywhere, and I had all these elements that make up the sort of American or Western understanding of what an Indian is. Everything that I wore was over-the-counter purchased, like items that were made in China or made in Mexico. They were not coming from communities. They were just very pan-Indian general. Most Americans don't know what they're looking at, so I capitalized on that and walked around D.C., L.A., Santa Fe, New York City for a year. I would just engage this process. The performance was very much about just existing in public and recording the interactions that I would have with people through film and through photography. And it was very much about engaging the understanding that Americans, or people from Western culture, because in D.C. there's certain places that are like Disneyland, so people are coming from all over the world to see these things, and the way that they engage their perception of the Indigenous image, and the good, the bad, the ugly, all the things that go along with that. And so that exploration was not cheap. That was something that I did based wholeheartedly on my own perception of myself, my own perception of my image sort of in the greater sphere of the United States or in the world. And embodying that was not easy, but I also spent a year at the National Museum of American Indians, the year that it opened, and discovered, along with a lot of coworkers, that there's a significant amount of ineptitude that Americans have in understanding just general basic ideas of contemporary or modern living Indigenous people. And so it was about stereotype. It was about microaggressions. It was about the historical trauma, which was more internalized because I had to put this thing on and I had to interact with people, and that interaction was really difficult. I had spaces of time that I just needed to take a break. That's the last American Indian on Earth. Some of it was also poking fun at like these ideas. I mean, spirit animal is one of these sort of tropes that exist in common spaces, and I had this idea of like mixing a trope with a word that is that, you know, before 2016 sort of Trump alt-right era, that was really the only word that you could get white folks to get defensive about, is to talk about white guilt, because there's a weird definition with that. And so it was a little bit about having this image and also like messing with people, sort of like a, I don't know, indigenous jackass. And so that was the first piece that I did, which had so many different elements to it, one of which being that the young man that I was working with that was helping me film, who was also working on his master's thesis at the Corcoran, ultimately took the project and made his own film. Without my involvement or permission. And so it was this interesting sort of process of realizing that these images do not belong to Native people. These are images that exist in America and are used and consumed without our input and without our benefit. The guy I was working with did exactly that concept and kind of tied the whole piece together. Red Skin was wholeheartedly about microaggressions. There is a set of vernacular that exists around, particularly the mascot debate is probably the most obvious place you can see it. You can Google mascot controversy and find any article and skip the article and go to the comments section. And you can see what exists there as this vernacular that is problematic and difficult and frankly just straight up racist. And we say that those are microaggressions. I think that's an important word, but I also think it's interesting because micro is sort of how those things that are said are perceived by someone on the outside and not how we perceive them. But because they're micro, people don't see them for what they are, the way that we see them. And so the performance piece was, for me to be the Indian in the room. I sat in the middle of a room and I had an installation, and it was a whole big art thing. And I had 4 antagonizers. And those 4 people were friends of mine and willing participants, and then most of whom I had to talk into doing this because it was sort of horrific. And their homework was go read those comment sections, pick up that vernacular, use that to talk to me in this space. And so they did that. They wore Redskins paraphernalia. The piece itself is called Redskin singular, which the team uses an S there at the end. And they spoke to me in the same vernacular that exists in these spaces, in these places. And that vernacular is informed by America's understanding of Indigenous people, which is to say that it's not informed. Cowboys and Indians was a contrived storyline that never happened. And so that's what people think that we are, that all Indians wear headdresses, that we have certain bone structures, that we have certain skin tones, that, you know, we don't have the variety that we do. And so these people talked to me in that way, and we did it for a solid 6 hours. And what was really interesting about it is when it was said and done, the next day, it was part of an art all night. There's a thing in DC, it's called art all night, so we did this all night. The next morning, I'm home, exhausted, and just chilling with my kids, watching cartoons. And I start getting text messages and phone calls from these 4 participants. 2 of them were just straight up bawling, just crying. They felt ashamed and they were just apologizing to me, because what happened was they started doing this and there's a lot of trepidation, but there was a mob mentality that went with it, and it just blew up. The way they were talking to me, the things they were doing, and it was all planned, but once they kind of got in the groove, it took off, and it disturbed them how natural it felt for them to do that, which is not completely natural, because afterwards they had like a moral sense to it and felt a lot of guilt. But I was struck by how difficult it was for them to reconcile that, and the fact that I was just at home chilling with my kids watching cartoons. That we are not prepared, but we are certainly equipped to deal with these things, because we deal with them all day, every day, all the time. We hear at least one thing a day, and you know, it may even be an off-cuff comment online, a statement in an article, and not necessarily dealing with people. And so that whole piece was about microaggressions. It was very much about that language. And I think those things tie into appropriation, because the American understanding of our existence and the image that's aligned with that, which is you know, literature and film and photography and art and all these visual mediums that have informed America that we are this thing and that we don't get to define that, has been implemented for hundreds of years and is at its core imagery that was appropriated from a limited understanding and has now become the status quo. And so we are trying to navigate this understanding without any of the power and any of the authority to say that these things are inappropriate. So, you know, we were talking about mascots last night, and you know, it's like fans of the team are like, no, we're trying to honor you. But then when a Native person says, you know, maybe it's inappropriate, they're like, shut up. And so that's the relationship. I think that's a good metaphor of the relationship that Native people end up having with American culture and American people at large.
So one of the things that also that Glenn brought up was the issue, this idea of appropriation versus plagiarism, or kind of the direct copying, which I kind of alluded to in some of the slides. Can you pull up the PowerPoint for Jamie Okuma, please? So Jamie, you know, you've had a recent experience where your work has been blatantly plagiarized. On the flip side, you have also worked in pure collaboration with other artists as well. So you have gone kind of from the, you know, like the true partnership side of things to being the victim of this form of plagiarism or direct copying. Could you talk a little bit about your experiences?
Yeah, do we have the...
Oh, you have the clicker? Yep.
Yeah, so first of all, with this entire symposium, I was kind of at a loss of where do I even begin? There's so much to talk about. We all have different feelings on it. Appropriation, appreciation, it's so porous. And so I can have opinions, but I don't ever want to sound hypocritical. So what I know best is myself and my experiences, just as everybody here. The way you think, the way someone may think of something being appropriated versus appreciation is because how we are all grown, how our life experiences shape that. And so I never want to be judgmental towards somebody about how they feel about something, because I've had that happen to me. So what I want to touch on is more or less the plagiarism side. And I've even grown and changed my thinking on it because of a very recent experience. And so this image here, I have a really strong memory of design. And so me and my mom, this last fall, we were cruising around Neiman Marcus, which is something I love to do. And I seen this bag here on the bottom. And I immediately remembered the beaded bag that I had seen. And so I was doing some research, looked at their line, and here's a close-up of the band from this bandolier bag that was blatantly ripped off. And here's another from that line. And I mean, they're beautiful, and I understand that. And the designer, you know, obviously they loved it. And yes, that's a form of flattery. And, oh, how do I go back? To put it in more perspective, these are my boots that were commissioned by the Peabody Essex. And what's a little bit different for these, this particular piece is people have me, they want to know the designs and what they mean and things like that. And generally, my work, I don't put a lot of that into it. And the boots is the complete opposite. They're a diary for me. And so this is like totally against my personality, but you're going to be hearing some of that to understand my feelings on theft and plagiarism. So in this piece, the swallows, I have a personal relationship with them. My grandmother's house was an old adobe, and she would water the birds. So every summer, me and my cousins, we'd go make mud for them. And they would build their houses on her roof. And as I got older, I worked at our tribe's water park, and the birds would build nests on the water slides, and they would fall out. So me and my family would raise them, and for some reason, all of their names were baby. So we had all these generational babies. So I was connected to them. And they would come back every year. And so those are what's in these boots. And the berries on the bottom is just a representational image of rose hips, which my grandma was obsessive when we go walk, and we'd run into rose bushes, and she'd get them and clean them out and eat them because of the vitamin C or whatever. So it's just these little stories of mine that are there that you may not see. It's appreciate just because I think it's pretty cool, and people seem to be attracted to it. But it's very, very personal for me. And so, I didn't even tell you this. In researching for this piece that we're working on, that I'm working on for the museum here, I was just looking at doll boots and construction. And then I found that. This company is called Integrity Toys. And that's my life on that doll. Something that I would never, ever have agreed to. And it was just, it still makes me angry looking at it. So there's a close-up of it, so you can see the comparison. They were a limited edition run of 600 that was sold out in one weekend at their convention. And not once had I just can't imagine. I hate looking at it. It's so upsetting. And so this is how it has changed my thinking going back to the Delaware bags. How do they know what those symbols meant to that artist? You don't know. And for me now, this is something that was so special to me is now on this scantily dressed doll called Changing Winds, which is in a reference to Pocahontas, for a company called Integrity Toys.
Thank you for sharing those stories. Yes, please, yeah. When Glenn was speaking earlier, he was talking about appropriation perhaps being, maybe I'm getting the quote wrong, but like a form of complete love, of something. But in many ways, I would argue that it's actually a form of fractional love. Specifically, it's maybe a complete love of a fractional understanding. believe it was Paul Chat-Smith, who is a curator at the National Museum of the American Indian, who's a citizen of the Comanche Nation. I believe it was him who said that people love Indian things, but they hate Indians. Meaning that there are aspects of indigenous cultures, visual cultures, whatever it may be, that people are drawn to. Maybe they have that really strong connection to, and maybe they've even want to adopt it into their own, their own practices. Whether it's, look in Europe, there's a concept of the Indianer, who are essentially European hobbyists who, on the weekends, live their lives as a native person in teepees and dressed up specifically in the same maybe 1860s clothing, because 1960s clothing would have been way after Native people lost their culture. That's the perception. They love certain things about indigenous culture, but they don't truly love the Native people. They're not there when addiction is an issue. They're not there when homelessness is an issue. They're not there when people are hurting. They see what they love and they take what they love, but they reject the rest of it. I know that's certainly experiences that many of you have had. And Gregg, you've talked a little bit about invisibility and the invisibility of indigenous people in people's perceptions. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, they want to be us, but they don't want our struggle. Because being Native, I think in the modern day is not just, powwow dance, and that's part of it. That stuff is there, but it's also the intergenerational trauma. I mean, we already know that there's such a thing as genetic memory, and that there's predispositions towards certain things. When alcoholism is introduced into communities to inebriate people, specifically to get them to sign unfair contracts for loss of land and spaces, that there's a really long history of trying to overcome that. But I think a really good sort of modern example of the invisibility of those things is everybody knows Indians are drunk. But nobody knows that Indians have the highest rate of sobriety than any other ethnic group in the country. And so we end up being the poor, sad, drunk Indian, but we're never the Indian that overcomes. And which is funny, because our entire existence in this country is about overcoming. Invisibility and inclusion, I think, are paramount aspects of the relationship that non-Native people in the West, and I'll speak to America a lot. I mean, obviously you could apply this to Canada and to Mexico and South America, but my experience is in America, so I will often say that Americans, because that is where I live. And when the mascot debate took off, this is something that struck me when it really took off on social media, and that's really how that took off. There began to be a number of panels and discussions on news sources, and I remember, what's his name? He's very regal, white hair. I'm trying to remember the news guy.
Aren't they all like
Anderson
that?
Cooper?
Yeah, well.
Anderson Cooper?
Anderson Cooper, thank you. Anderson Cooper, who's known for being pretty progressive, had a panel discussion to discuss mascots, and he had 5 people in the studio, and not one of them was Native. Not a single one of them was Native. People of color were brought in, and there's an ambiguity to brownness within these discussions, that you can simply bring a brown person because there's an intersection that happens with that. But the truth is that there is really specific nuance to these experiences and to this perspective of these things, whether a Native person is in favor of or against something like sports mascots. But we are not allowed to have that nuanced conversation outside of ourselves. We're hardly ever invited to the table. And that's true in other places too. I did an installation with the Smithsonian in 2016 as part of a large group show, and part of my installation included a massive teepee that was inside this building, the Arts and Industry building, which I think is the second Smithsonian building that was built on the National Mall. It's right next to the Smithsonian Castle. And a person came to interview me about my installation and the performance piece that was associated with it. And she said, "So you're a Native American artist?" And I immediately knew what she meant and was like, "Well, what do you mean, playing devil's advocate?" And she said, "Well, you show your work down in Santa Fe and you do all that thing." And I said, "I've never shown my work in Santa Fe." But what happened in her question is she relegated me to a small corner in the Southwest where all Indian artists are essentially banished to be forever. And asked me a question that was specifically associated with her perception of me. And I asked her, if you were talking to a white man, would you ask him if he is a Euro-American artist? And she said, "No, of course not." And the fact that she said, "of course not," spoke to the privilege of her question. But it's also about that invisibility. Like, can I not be an artist that is informed by my identity and therefore be able to participate in these arenas that are about the greater Western art world? Or do I have to have a sense of, excitement from my culture that you connect with in order for you to find value within my work? If I tell you a story that's not familiar, does that story no longer have value because it's not familiar to you? Or are you just cool with my work as long as I'm painting old men in headdresses? And so this is a big part, like for me, within the greater contemporary art world. This is the struggle that I have, that we as Native people are informed by the world we live in, and the world we live in is informed by something that is either contrived, that is fake, or that is pigeonholed into a really, really limited view of what a Native person is. And so, like, my effort is to be in spaces as a Native artist and to create work that's not necessarily informed by a Western buyer's market, which is an inherent risk, of course, because if I'm not making something that is familiar to everybody else, then it might not sell. And if I don't sell work, then I can't put food on the table, and I've got 5 hungry kids, and that's not cool. So there's that whole aspect about the way that we're perceived, which feeds to invisibility if you don't play ball. And that's a big part of that. And I mean, I can't speak to it as well, but you could extend that to women who are also artists that are Native artists, because the invisibility is even greater within that realm, because Native women are this sort of sexualized, subservient, non-speaking non-entities, that the most progressive Native woman in popular culture is Disney's Pocahontas, and to the benefit of Disney's Pocahontas, Irene Bedard is a Native actress and informed that character, which is at the time that it was made was a step forward, but I know Native women to be incredibly strong and articulate and great storytellers and givers of life, and with so much more to give, and how much more ostracized are Native women in addition to just women in general. Yeah. And so that lends to that invisibility even more so, I think.
Jamie, could you, picking up on where Gregg left off, can you talk about some of the challenges that you as an artist, as a fashion designer, have faced with issues of invisibility or trying to be seen in these industries that have often or long time ignored the advances of work by artists such as yourself?
I don't think, honestly, I can say that I've felt that.
Okay.
As you know, I've been in the art world for a very long time. I've successfully been a professional since I was 18 years old, and this is all I've done. I've not had another job. This is my job. And so I don't think that has affected me, and especially in where I grew up and where I live now, our tribal society would lean more on the matrilineal type side, we're very equal. So when I hear, I can understand people do go through that, but for me, I have not. Maybe others would see that there would have been challenges for me, but with the internet now and social media, we have a voice. And my ability to have this career proves that. So yeah, I'm not one to talk on that.
No. That's an important point to bring out. That that it is the experience of some, but obviously not of all. Ramona, you had mentioned something that I wanted to touch base on again about in your own community. You talked about how people have been replicating and mass producing embroidered clothing specifically from your community for in factories in China, which are referred to as festival or boho wear. Is that right?
Yeah.
Could you talk about that and kind of your own experience in that area?
Yeah. So several years ago, we were having a ceremony, Dia de los Muertos ceremony, and we had indigenous artisans from Mexico who brought clothing to sell, very similar to this, and this was made in Mexico by artisans there. And there were folks coming and snapping pictures, and I didn't even notice it, but one of the elders there ran over and kind of slapped him, which was awesome. And she told me, she was like, they're taking pictures and they're going to send them back to China where they can mass produce them. And lo and behold, several months later, I see this kind of thing, which used to be really hard for me to find. It's everywhere now. You can Google on Etsy, just boho, Mexican dress or something, and something like this comes up, and it's a mass-produced kind of thing. And the problem is, there's a lot of problems with it, but I really want to acknowledge and honor what you said about just the complexity of appropriation, the idea, and that different people have different ideas about what is sharing or what is what's meant to be sacred and not shared, and so it is complex, and I definitely want to acknowledge that. But part of the problem is that impacts the economy for indigenous artisans in Mexico, or those folks who are still connected to them in our communities here. And it just, to me, one of the things I think about, and I was thinking about as you were talking, both of you, is just the importance of relationship. And as indigenous people, I think relationship is really fundamental to how we interact with one another and how we consider, not just our human relations, but our relationship with all things as this interconnected, familial relationship. And so I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of indigenous artists who make a living by selling cultural artifacts to non-native people, and that is important. That's an important part of our economy. The Huichol tribe down in Mexico does this really beautiful beading, and they sell it increasingly here in the United States too, so that they can continue to fight for sovereignty, so they can continue to fight for the preservation of their land. So it's complicated. Mm-hmm. Because folks, I think, will see something, perhaps fall in love with it, but not have appreciation for the spirit or connection to the person who creates it. And to me, that's the problem of capitalism and consumption, or capitalist consumption, which is about, I can buy something and it belongs to me, and then my relationship to the artist or the creation, or even the, what brought the aspects of the piece to life, then it ends. Because I've completed this transaction and now I own it. And I think the problem of that transaction is the entitlement piece, that somehow everything that's, a part of the piece that I bought now belongs to me, and my relationship to the person or people or land that created it just is not even considered. I was putting on these earrings this morning, and they're really special to me because they were made by a Chicano artist who is the father of a beloved friend, and I was so happy.
I can't stop looking at them. They're so bright.
I love them so much. I have an unhealthy love with these. But I wear them for special occasions, y'all. You're special. So, but I was just filled with so much happiness because I love him. I was able to support him. And this was another piece made by him, but it was a gift. And I think about him, and I think about the people that I love surrounded by him as I, adorn myself with these things that are part of our kind of cultural creation, interpretation of our cultural items.
We better take a few minutes to take a few questions, and then I'm sure everyone wants to go eat. The lights are really bright, so I can't see very many hands. So Jared and Chris are kind of on the aisles, and they have a few. But we could do either way, I guess. However we want to do it, I don't really care anymore. I tried. I mean, but for the people who did write things down, let's please do. You can go through the questions and then use the mic yourselves to ask the questions.
Should I? It's here.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, how about the appropriation of the name America? America is a whole continent. I just wanted to hear your back because it's always talking to America. America is not just the U.S., it's the whole continent. And people from other countries, we're also Americans. And just, that's a very basic thing, and we never talk about it. America is not the U.S., it's the whole continent.
In some ways, conceptually, I think it gets down to the idea of lumpers and splitters. People who like to lump everyone together and people who like to split people apart and also exclude. Do you have anyone have anything in particular to add to that, or?
I mean, I don't know. It's sort of like when we say Indians or Native Americans. It's a made-up term to lump people together. I'm Paiute, I'm Numa, I'm Kiuyu Takata, and that's how we refer to ourselves. I mean, I always, because I think about language in terms of like America, we celebrate Columbus in this country, like really celebrate Columbus as the discoverer of America. He discovered a couple islands in the Bahamas and never set foot here, and or any of the other mainland places. But my understanding is that word comes from American Vespucci and is sort of pointed in that direction. Gosh, man, that's a really complicated question.
Yeah. Let's. Could you go ahead and Chris?
Just read the questions off?
Please. Yeah.
So the first question is about Pendleton blankets and the complexities of the designs that are appropriated, but then how these blankets are also exchanged amongst tribal groups. So I wonder if anybody on the panel would like to speak towards the complexities of the issues of appropriation as it relates to Pendleton blankets.
Just by 8th generation. They're Native-owned company doing Pendleton-style blankets, wool blankets, so there's an option to do that.
Wool that they get from indigenous people in New Zealand.
Awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
But that, I mean, those are, yeah, Pendleton. I mean, I have Pendleton blankets in my house, so I can't really answer that question.
I bet most natives in this room have Pendleton. I almost wore Pendleton shoes today. I was like,
But I haven't bought one since 8th generation's been around, so there's that.
I think as these conversations progress, there's more of an acknowledgement to the relationship that major companies and industries like Pendleton have with indigenous people. The reason why 8th generation was created was because of that. And so I don't see Pendletons as much. They're still out there. They're totally still out there. They're a mainstay. Yeah, yeah. But that conversation is becoming more prominent, and I think that's an interesting development in terms of sort of redefining, the things that we engage. But I think it'll probably still be a long time before we don't see Pendletons on native backs.
Jared?
So this question is for Gregg. Can you talk about the reaches of the audience for the Redskin performance? Do you think they took something away from it and learned something?
I don't want to say I don't care. When I create work to create work. I am not necessarily creating it to be educational. not necessarily creating something so that I can change people's minds, because more often than not, what I'm creating is based on my own experience as a Native person, and I'm expressing it or articulating it through the work. If that helps people understand, if it helps shed light on things, like, I accept that as part of the work. But anytime I set out to do something, I'm doing it because I'm using my voice. I don't speak for Indian country. I don't even speak for my tribe. I speak for myself, and I speak for my experience, and sometimes I'll speak for my children's experience. Those things do overflow into areas of understanding and shedding light on things, as I think art does sometimes. But my goal is not to educate so much as it is to make work, to make art, and to express myself. And part of my human experience as an Indigenous person, it can be many things, and that's included.
Okay. For the sake of time, unfortunately, we're going to have to cut it off right now. Thank you.